Hello, everyone. I don't know whose water that is. Maybe that's Patrick's. We'll leave that there. Well, thank you very much for having me today. Pleasure to bring Edmonton's experience to Calgary, and I'm happy to be back on U of C grounds. This is not where I went to school. I was actually in the main campus in the EVDS building. I don't even know if it's an EVDS building anymore. No? Something else? Professional faculty, that's great. But yeah, coming back here brings back memories. Still stand on the shoulders of people that lifted me up, including Sasha here, and even Byron, Professor Miller. He was in my master's degree project defense all those years ago. I think it was about 15 years ago now. I'm pretty sure you don't remember. That was a while ago. It was about the cultural regeneration or using cultural regeneration as a tool for urban redevelopment. You had probably the best question of me of the day, outside of how long did it actually take me to write this piece of work. You asked, what does culture mean to me? That really stumped me because my research focused around Manchester's city as well as Rotterdam, and culture there was around their soccer teams and how they were using soccer stadiums to rejuvenate the old industrial lands. So my answer, I believed was, well, culture is, everything and everywhere. It depends what and who you're talking to at the time. I don't know if that was sufficient, but I did graduate without having to go back and redo the defense, so thank you to you both on that one. But yeah, so talking about housing affordability and zoning bylaw renewals or land use bylaw renewals and instituting, well, what we are learning today is mass rezoning. It's going to be a little bit of a different conversation than what we heard previously about it. And Edmonton, like all other cities, is unique upon itself. We've tried many things. We tried Vancouverism once around the land lift, around our transit-oriented development nodes. Didn't really work out so well because we kept on finding that we are too permissive in our zoning everywhere across the city. So that inability to create that demand or that supply constraint and therefore that land lift has hindered sort of that tool within the city of Edmonton itself. So similar to Calgary, Edmonton has undergone, or I guess not similar to Calgary just yet. I'm not sure what's going to happen across the street. 1,000 people still had their say, but in October of last year, the city of Edmonton concluded a 5-year project to overhaul its entire zoning bylaw. It was a rewriting of the document at the time, and I see that one of the senior planners is actually here today. He'll correct me if I'm wrong, but the zoning bylaw, if you were printed out at that time, it was about this big. It started off in 1961, and we slowly added to it and added to it and added to it. We amended some things, but we never took anything away. Edmonton at the time was a city of 300,000 or so. We're now a city of 1.1 million, and obviously there's, 60 years in between. So things do change, values change, and how the direction of the city changes as well. So we went through a similar process where we had a 6-day public hearing and 300 people show up, roughly about half and half. Half for, half against. So like all things, the two prairie cities, they go through their same struggles, but differently, but the same at the same time. A little bit differently. But that's great because we get to learn from each other depending on who goes first and who goes second. We get to learn from each other's mistakes. But why Edmonton? As Lil mentioned, Edmonton's a city now of 1.1 million or so. It added 100,000 in the last 2 years, so it's a very similar trajectory to Calgary in terms of adding that population in steps as the economic activity increases and then wanes over time. We also have one of the youngest and fastest growing populations. I think our median population is about 34, 35, again, similar to Calgary. It also has very high disposable income, again, similar to Calgary. I would say the median's probably roughly the same, but the distribution is probably far greater in Calgary in terms of you see that very high spectrum, where in Edmonton it's that concentration is a little bit more around that middle. So why is Edmonton a good example about this? So Edmonton in the last, I don't know, 15, 20 years, well, more than that, has generally a fairly, as I mentioned, permissive planning environment, and we are undergoing basically a wholesale change of our planning framework to help support our goals around population growth, housing affordability, sustainability, and climate change. So here's just a little graphics to put it in context around housing affordability. So this is last quarter, 2023, Q4 from the National Bank was measuring the deterioration of housing affordability. On the top end of the spectrum, you have Vancouver, not a news story there. At the low end, you have Edmonton. So this isn't a case where you have a city that's shrinking or not growing, and therefore you have a corresponding population decrease and lack of demand to keep those housing prices high. As mentioned, you have actually the exact opposite. You have a population boom. We haven't seen, just like Calgary, that type of population growth in the last 2 to 3 years in decades. So there is something going on between the two cities. What it is, I'll leave the theorists to figure that one out. I'll just tell you what our experience is, and then I can be told if I'm wrong or not, which is fine. But yeah, so a big gap just in terms of how even Edmonton and Calgary are faring through the last, quarter, and it's just one point in data. But you can see that Calgary is just behind Vancouver and Toronto, I guess Victoria, not Toronto, in terms of that deterioration of housing affordability in the face of population growth. A little bit more contextualizing the difference between Edmonton and Calgary itself. Very similar trajectories as you see, the same bumps as you go along through time from 2008, but the graphs start and end at different points. Right now you have a median income or medium rental rate or affordability rate within Edmonton between $1,400 and $1,600. Well, in Calgary, we're at $1,800 and $2,000. So about a 20% change there, and that stays true as you look at that blended affordability matrix, not matrix, that blended affordability graph in terms of how it relates to each other. It's about 20% more affordable. On the Edmonton to Vancouver side, it's about 3 times more affordable, and Toronto is 2.5 times. So what does this all mean, and why is planning important, and are we abandoning planning through a mass rezoning? Or is the mass rezoning a tool to achieve the objectives that we outline? So the city plan, which is Edmonton's Municipal Development Plan, or in BC terms, the OCP, guides our development, and this was passed in 2020, so it represents a fairly modern vision of the city. It's a different take in terms of what we had in 2010, which was a typical planning horizon of 10 years. This is what the 2010 plan looked like. I don't know if anyone could tell from that what the city wants to be, other than, I don't even know, green, yellow, and brown. Very, very exciting, very visionary, very directive, where it was planning on a 10-year horizon, and then so renew these plans on 10 years. The city plan, Edmonton's new city plan, takes a very different direction. It is looking at directing growth instead of just continually outward, really looking at creating a different type of growth around nodes and corridors. So playing on the strengths of the existing nodes and corridors and creating new ones, as well as further greenfield growth to ensure that those housing types and varieties are maintained. But very directive, and also the switch here is that instead of a 10-year planning horizon, because cities don't really build in 10-year increments, we took a population horizon. So looking at what the city is going to look like in 2 million, and how do we accommodate that city, that amount of growth in a sustainable way, which allows all of the people to have attainable housing, but as well as transportation options, as well as it doesn't make the city go broke. And we'll learn a little bit about that in a bit, because at the end of the day, we have a fairly large, what we call inside the Anthony Henday, our ring road accounts for a large landmass and redevelopment potential, and the average housing age is coming up for renewal. So how do we best plan, and what does that renewal look like to best utilize that infrastructure that's in place already, and to achieve our directive growth around nodes and corridors, which helps transit and user or transportation mobility, as well as climate resilience in terms of how do we reduce our greenhouse gases and create an urban form that is resilient to change. Just so overall in that planning context, this is a planning faculty, so we've got to throw some planning jargon at you in terms of the various levels of statutory and non-statutory plans and how all those tools align. I think the important part here is not that we have a bunch of planning tools, is that the municipalities are restricted in their tools and their devices that they can in terms of shaping that housing affordability conversation. It's a lot broader conversation than just the municipality and the tools that they have at their disposal. But within those tools that we do have, how do we use them to achieve our goals and direct growth in an appropriate manner? And I say direct growth because this is a growth plan. It's not a contraction plan. It is a growth plan, which is important in that conversation of maintaining that affordability across the housing unit type spectrum and not necessarily the single family. So on that planning spectrum, you have that large city plan. In Edmonton, similar to Calgary, what we're doing is instead of individual neighborhood planning, we're leveling it up a little bit to what we call district planning. So we have 15 districts kind of based off the Montreal boroughs mentality that's been in place ever since they were settled. So sorry about that. But bringing sort of that local knowledge up a level so that we're not entrenched in the unique community conversation that tends to happen when we go neighborhood by neighborhood. Even though they are unique, every neighborhood is unique. Sometimes there's a lot of similarities throughout them, and how we plan them becomes similar in terms of infrastructure provision and the amenities that are needed to supply these areas. So really the district plan is looking to get rid of all of what we call the area redevelopment plans, which saw in the 1980s, probably similar to Calgary, to their local plans. We had a real resurgence of area redevelopment plans, which I wouldn't actually call area redevelopment plans, but rather area protectionist plans, as they were a response to the rapid and probably haphazard growth of the 1970s of the last couple of oil booms when that occurred. So the response to that was to lock down all these neighborhoods to ensure that whatever was there existing today should remain forever in perpetuity outside of a few redevelopment parcels. The neighborhood structure plans are the new growth plans for new neighborhoods, and then obviously the regulatory, the land use bylaw or the zoning bylaw. Up in Edmonton, we call it the zoning bylaw. Somehow we have a more American influence on our planning tools than Calgary, who tends to hire American planners. So go figure. All right, so is zoning really the barrier to the city that we want, or is it a facilitator of the city that we want, or is it the facilitator of that affordability that we all care for? I think that answer is it probably depends on what tool you're using, how old it is, what it looks like, what it's trying to do, and how it fits into that overall planning framework. I would venture to say a 1960 zoning bylaw that doesn't reflect the values and nature of today's development and the realities of the fiscal constraints is probably a barrier to the city that we want. It's probably a barrier to affordability. Yes, it may maintain the single-family neighborhoods, but is that the best type of neighborhood that we want in terms of if we're going to go about redeveloping these neighborhoods? There's a lot of excess capacity in this infrastructure as they are redeveloped, so how do we best utilize that? And I say there's a lot of excess capacity in the infrastructures because we figured out how to use water a lot more efficiently. We're about a third on water use compared to what we were in the 1970s, so a lot of excess capacity there, especially on the sewer network, which is actually causing problems in the city of Edmonton. So if you go up there and it smells a little funky in some neighborhoods, it's because there's not enough water going through. So redevelopment will help that. More toilets flushing. It's all good. But yeah, is zoning a barrier? I think the history of zoning, as lots of us know here, is that it was meant to protect from unhealthy outcomes, and it's kind of morphed over time in terms of what it has started to either protect or facilitate or want. As a planner, my belief is that we are here to facilitate the growth in line with the public interest, and that public interest is defined not a point in time from a few years ago, but how it evolves and what that that future is for the city and what we want that to look like, which is informed by the citizenry and politicians. So approving a new zoning bylaw, which I'll give you, it's no surprise, it made as of right everywhere in every residential zone, a minimum of 8 units. So how did we get there? It's a classic incremental approach. I can't take credit for this, although I was at the city for most of the time. This is me just, as I said with my previous academic professors, standing on the shoulders of colleagues and wrapping it up all nicely together. I would also like to say that we had a vision in 2010 that in 2023 we were going to pass a zoning bylaw that got rid of, or I guess that didn't get rid of because we did that before, but allowed 8 units everywhere. That's not the case. But it's the case of classic incrementalism and bringing the population along and the city along in order to achieve our long-term goals and those fiscal realities. So in 2010, that nice brown, yellow, orange picture of the MDP, or the Municipal Development Plan, that was our first step in terms of redeveloping the city. It had the first tangible goal within a policy, a statutory policy, that looked to achieve 25% of infill within the inner suburbs, or the redeveloping area, which is the inside of the ring, which was a big monumental step at the time. At the time, we were at about 18% in terms of the unit growth of redeveloping areas. So how did we get to that 25%? There's a couple of aspects, including an infill roadmap, which outlined a bunch of actions, excuse me, including 50 lot splits. So a classic 50-foot by 150-foot lot, standard tract housing in the 1950s and 60s. That was sort of our benchmark in terms of what we can do. How do we want these cities to evolve? So before 2015, if you wanted to do something smaller than 50 feet, you had to come to council. That's a 6-month process. And then maybe you got a duplex. And really what we call colloquially skinny houses or narrow houses wasn't even an existing housing product back then. So that's really increasing the utility of that land twofold. So 1 house to 2 houses. Anecdotally, I don't have any numbers to back it up. Sorry, Dr. Somerville. Maybe you could do some research in Edmonton. But in 2015, when the housing splits were allowed, there was a big uproar. There were communities out there that wanted to coalesce around putting restrictive covenants on all of their lots in the community so that you couldn't split it. It was a great idea until they figured out that it didn't matter what you did on your lot, because if the person next to you didn't do it, then you were still impacted, and if you had the RC on your title, then you were kind of hooped in terms of redevelopment potential. So lots of fun with that. It took a while to get through there, and actually people don't really like the narrow or the skinny lots up until probably about 2018 when we did some more things to make even more housing allowed. But in terms of price and what that did to prices, I think what you saw is those neighborhoods of choice, those desirable neighborhoods that were already desirable, they were the first ones to undergo sort of these lot splits, and that's where you see the majority of them today. You see whole blocks redone, and what that did is, just anecdotally, you probably had a $400,000 land price with a 1940s house on it. It was split, and depending on the neighborhood, if it was a neighborhood, an affluent neighborhood, you probably got 2 $800,000 units on there, 2 $800,000 houses, each of about 2,000 square feet, which was way more than the original 1940s, what I call them Baba houses, because they were like, I don't know, 700 square feet semi-bungalows. But also, interestingly enough, on the other side of the street, so to speak, in terms of not the super affluent neighborhoods, but when we saw lot splits in fairly attainable neighborhoods, that affordability maintained. So you maybe had a $300,000 lot price for the same type of housing, same age of housing. And when it was a split and then new houses built, the price was around $550,000. So I think the $550,000 for a brand new 2,000 square foot house that has 60 to 70 years left in it, that price differential, I think there's some value there in terms of what was created with it. So that was lot splits. At the same time, we allowed garage suites. This was way before, back in the early 2000s, where we legalized all secondary suites, but now the laneway homes as of right. And then we kind of got through some of those low-hanging fruits in terms of what we'll do with the infill roadmap. Then we came up with the infill roadmap version 2. And that really looked at attacking sort of that missing middle housing and what to do with that, which led in 2018 sort of that elimination of all single-family zoning, where we allowed, as of right, 4 units on per lot with duplexes or splits, and the same thing with secondaries or garage suites. So you split 1 lot, you get 2 lots with 2 units, and either a secondary garage suite on it equals 4. Not many people knew about this. I think this was a stealth change because 6 years later, they still thought all their neighborhoods were single-family zoned. So good thing, bad thing, I don't know. I won't judge past practices. On the missing middle side, we really looked at trying to allow some of those 4-story apartment buildings. Again, our zoning was created in a manner where the single-family detached house was paramount, and so everything was built off of that. So we had large setbacks for 4-story buildings, even though at the end of the day they were probably only 2 or 3 meters taller because of the height of the houses these days. So we looked at reducing setbacks, increasing the FAR or the FSR on them, and also allowing some different type of row housing throughout the neighborhoods. Really working with our development partners to see what's actually buildable out there, as was noted earlier today in terms of how to make it successful, because if you can't build it, there's no point in causing the uproar to make it happen. What's really exciting in 2020, we eliminated our parking minimums. So this doesn't mean no parking everywhere. It just means the development will build the parking that's necessary to service development. So if it's next to the University of Calgary and the expected people are students or international students that don't have any cars or need for cars, then they can build no parking. So what's important on the affordability context is if you are building underground parking, it's around $30,000 to $50,000 an underground stall. So you're removing that cost possibly from the product in general. What really kicked this one off and what really showed that this was an important feature is that we had an affordable housing project which went through our normal processes, had its parking requirements, had to build a giant parkade for about $3 million, and they showed up at council, they clicked a bunch of pictures of nobody in the parkade, and the message was that $3 million could have been used to build units in that building instead of parking. So it was spurred by a number of things, and 4 years on, there isn't parking Armageddon. Walmart still builds Walmart parking lots. That's okay. We do have maximums downtown, so we haven't got rid of those. But what we're seeing is that, yeah, some people park in the streets, and guess what? The street's a public use or public space. It's not owned by the person in front or that owns the house next door. So in a lot of our row housing and semi-detached, parking is still provided, but some of them may park on the street, which is okay, because if you surveyed most Edmontonians and asked what they did with their garages, it's usually just storage, and they park on the street anyways. So take it for what you will. I do also agree that you're not going to sell $1 million condos without parking, but you may only require 1 instead of 2, because the old parking standards were based on the square footage of each unit. So the bigger the unit, the more parking spaces you had, etc. So if someone wants to buy 3 parking stalls, fill your boots. If you don't want to, don't as well. At the same time, this was really about leveling the playing field for housing, and that housing is housing. Housing shouldn't have different names depending on the users who are in it. So until 2020, we had different use classes around affordable housing and just apartment dwelling units. So we collapsed those two. So there wasn't any permitting or regulatory snafus in terms of providing affordable housing or supportive housing within it. So for supportive housing, everything's from those units that require different wraparound services all the way up to market affordable. So it was really trying to get away from the fact that we're regulating the impact, not the user, and whoever's using that space, whether it's an affordable tenant or a market tenant, their impact on the land and the system at large is the same. At the same time as the city plan, which talked a little bit before, but really get into about making choices. And those choices were, how do we want to grow? And as I mentioned, it was around those nodes and corridors, so we needed a policy framework to get there. But how did we move people along in terms of saying this is the right way to grow? Well, there was a lot of data and modeling, and thanks to our data and modeling scientists, we modeled out different growth patterns within the city of Edmonton to see what would be the best choice for transportation and mobility split, what would be the best choice for the reduction of greenhouse gases, what would be the best choice for impact on the tax and the tax assessment. And what that all came down to was really a blend of the two. Like any good exercise, you have three different straw man, and then you just bring them all together and you say that's the preferred one. So that's the approach was a little bit, it wasn't just piling on the existing nodes and corridors, it was about growing more and creating new nodes and corridors, as well as having that relief valve for new development in new neighborhoods as well. So not business as usual, which, as mentioned before, that split was around 18% infill. What is that equaled? Math, 82% new growth in new growth areas. So really pushing the boundary and looking for 50% of that growth to happen within the infill areas. What's really interesting is through that modeling and what was really compelling in terms of coming around to that holistic affordability conversation, which isn't just the price of the home, but also takes into consideration your price of transportation as well as your taxation and the running of the city. Because at the end of the day, there is only one payer, and that's all of us, whether we pay it through taxes or the unit price of the building. It'll all come back to roost at some point in time. So what the modeling showed is that instead of the business as usual that Edmonton was growing at for the last 50 years, if we went towards a more directive, more concentrated growth, that we would save 10% on our capital expenditures over the lifetime of the plan, which when we're talking 30 billions becomes lots of money, about 3 billion. And then what that ended up being over the life of the plan is a difference of about an 8% on your tax levy, which funny enough, we just passed an 8.9% tax increase, but that's 8% over the life of the plan, not in just 1 year. I think Calgary might be beating us there on that tax increase. I can't remember. It's probably the same, relatively the same, with most municipalities. So again, what did it look at doing? It was saving 500 hectares of land from development. It was actively supporting redevelopment with 50% of units within the redeveloping area. It reduced greenhouse gases because of that mobility split in terms of increasing transit users and active modes. And it looked to help maintain Edmonton's fiscal performance in the long term. Again, just some numbers and some modeling. I don't know if this has been tested in the 4 years or so, or I guess it's a little bit too early to show, but just in terms of that overall holistic affordability conversation, we all know every car you add increase your cost of living. I think the latest is about $10,000 per car per year. So that notion of just drive until you can afford, well, you can afford the mortgage, but can you afford to drive is a different conversation. So when we look to concentrate and direct growth around transit lines and nodes of activity, it's modeled out to save about $700 annually on our transportation costs. All right, so now the real fun. Citywide zoning and zoning bylaw. What is it meant to do? Well, it's meant to simplify things. Very complex rule book down to, well, less than half. We started out with 151 different types of uses. We're down to 52 now, roughly, approximately. And the same thing for amount of zones throughout the city. We had about 71 existing zones before last year, and now we're down to around 40, I think. And hopefully we're not adding any new ones new fast. We want to see if the work we did is working the way it's intended, but we are changing as we go. But that simplified, streamlined framework is around some basic themes. The first one around housing first, so it's about allowing more housing everywhere. It's also allowing the economic development to take hold and mold as market preferences changes. So it's about being nimble, and by creating broad buckets, you allow for that that flexibility within each zone. You don't have to go back and take 6 months to rezone, go to council, miss that market cycle. You got to sit on your land for another 5 years, and then you probably got to go rezone anyways because whatever you thought you were going to build 5 years ago is not working. So in the end, trying to make things simpler and enabling a faster, more efficient planning process. So the new zoning bylaw just wasn't about the low density zones. We rewrote the whole thing, including our commercial zones, our high density zones, really had a lens of equitability on it, user friendliness, because we're trying to extract and remove all of the old vestiges in the old zoning bylaw that became almost exclusionary in terms of how they were acting and being implemented. So trying to get rid of those, trying to make sure non-planners and non-consultants understand what we're talking about. You know, at the end of the day, you know, that's probably relative in terms of trying to bring this type of information to the general public. But we also rezoned the whole city in alignment with the new zoning bylaw, and that also includes new technology for the user interface and implementing it. So again, simpler, better, more efficient, fewer uses, fewer zones, more permitted as of right uses. We've actually taken out all of our discretionary uses except for some of our uses in the river valley, which we want to maintain control to preserve and protect, but went to a conditional permitting system where if you satisfy XYZ, then you get your permit instead of being up to the discretion of the development officer and then subject to appeal with the community league if you were on a unique parcel that needed some additional variances or what have you. So again, the approach, as mentioned, I won't go over this again, but basically knew everything, easier, broader, more flexible. As mentioned, more housing everywhere. So in that one zone, you can do single detached, not a front drive in redeveloping areas, but you can do front drive in new developing areas. You can do a semi-detached. You can do some row housing. You can do backyard housing, multi-unit housing, or cluster housing. So in that base residential zone, you can do up to 8 units. Pretty similar to the, what is it, the RCG, is that right? Yeah. RCG zone here, having a look at it, I think there's some discrepancies around site area between the two cities, but I don't want to talk too much about that as it's a live public hearing and people will tweet me or something. So don't want to do that. But yeah, it's really that housing first mentality where we have growth, we want to support growth, and if we have goals of 50% infill for all those tangible and laudable goals of sustainability and creating a more redevelopable and resilient city, we have to let it happen, including supporting economic investment, which hopefully also involves reducing the regulatory snafus. I'm going to use that line, Dr. Somerville, for going forward because I think it's a good one. We've spent a lot of time streamlining our regulatory process. Again, similar to the belief of we're here to facilitate developments in terms of alignment with our longer term goals and policies. So if they align, then we should allow it to happen and allow it to happen in an efficient manner that allows developers and housing providers to get their product to market. So we've been on that journey for a number of years, and there's just some general stats there, but really focusing on that service delivery aspect, reducing regulations, creating that consistent regulatory framework that supports development so that you continue to do business within the city. This guy's sure going to do business in the city because he can click his button and get a permit in 3 seconds here. But really, it's just about creating those systems, and I think technology is there now that we can do that in a predictable manner that allows ease of access, but also ease of permitting. Obviously, if it's outside the bounds of our rules and regulations, that type of service gets longer and longer, and you probably get trips to public hearing, et cetera. But the idea is to keep on improving through automation. We're about to hit the go live button on automating all of our single family housing permits. We're starting with that one because that's the easiest box to automate. It's one house within 12-meter high, a couple of setbacks, and there you go. So it actually puts the onus on a developer to input all the numbers, and they get their permit as soon as they do that, so it's essentially automatic. That'll be expanded to the different housing forms and used to basically Is there any planning techs in the room? I think there's planning techs in the room. Basically do the planning tech jobs of today, which is that first cursory review to see if anything's outside the box. But don't worry, lots of growth, 2 million people. We're always going to need planners and consultants, so we're not taking your jobs away. And that led us to the #1 ranking in the CHBA's annual municipal benchmarking study for permitting practices and affordability. We're a couple of years away, but we still like to toot that horn. Calgary's #3 there. I'll say that you're actually you're quicker in our building permit review, but overall we're better still. So, thanks. So what have we learned? I think through the zoning bylaw, there's that incremental approach, but also when you're about to do that transformational change, that engagement is important. This was a 5-year venture. We tried every engagement tactic under the sun, between videos, podcasts, newsletters, even paper advertisements. We had planners sit in a chair and talk on the phone, talk on the video screen, go to the communities to get people engaged, because nobody really engages in zoning and zoning regulations until the public hearing date, because it doesn't mean anything to them, or until it's too late, until you actually see the building and the row house built next door. That's when maybe you get the bylaws flipped, like the single-use bylaw. But at the end of the day, that engagement was incredibly important to the success of our zoning venture. And early indicators, I like this stat. It's not a lot, but in the 4 months since we allowed basically mid-block 4-unit row houses with 4 secondary suites, we've had 200 permitted permits come through and approved. Those 200 house units would have represented probably 30 or 50 prior to the existing regulations. They also represent projects that would have had to gone to public hearing, created a 6-month delay in it, but they have those rights now, and they're out building those units. So some early indicators that at least the market is responding. We'll see how the populace responds in the coming days. So thanks for learning about Edmonton, and I think I just want to leave you with one thing. Like if we have our plans and our directions and our targets of 50% infill, if we don't take purposeful action, which a lot of times is going to take courage both on the administration side, the politician side, and the community side, and we don't actually take those actions to implement what we say we want to do, it isn't going to happen. So without that purposeful action, and zoning is a tool, one of them, I guess the debate or the jury's still up in the air whether or not mass zoning is the right way to do it, but it does address the need for housing, and we'll see as the academia crunches the numbers in the coming years. And luckily now we have a planning, a couple of months, decades. Luckily we do have a planning department at U of A now, so we'll have that academic strength behind us as well in terms of creating and curating policy. But do thank you, and happy to take questions.